All right, welcome back to our workshop on elemental magic and pentagram rituals. So as you just saw, the first part we covered some basic foundational concepts about the 4 and 5 elements, and then we learned the lesser ritual of the pentagram. So now we're going to add on some more, slightly more advanced or elaborations about the elements, and we will also learn the greater ritual of the pentagram and some other usage for the pentagram and a few other notes about elemental magic. So yeah, let's just jump right into it. There's a bunch of stuff still to cover. All right, so I'm just going to take a minute and talk about the idea of the human constitution and of human nature as symbolized by the elements. This is something that I think has already come up a little bit. So obviously there's the idea of the physical body represented by the 4 elements, right? And we talked about the necessity of water and having water in the body, for life, the physical structure, the bones and all that, right? The earth, the breath, like the vital heat. And you can think of, I like to think of fire inside of the body as being like the metabolism, which is not flame, but it is a kind of burning, right? Anything about, I mean, we even talk about burning calories or burning fat, and that's actually, that is literal. It is a kind of combustion. But it's an active thing. It's not a substance. It's like a process, in the process of energy, in the warmth, that our bodies need to sustain. But we can also talk about, the human, like the entire kind of psycho-spiritual constitution in addition to the physical constitution. And we can also talk about character and personality. And so this is an important distinction to make between like constitution and personality. In terms of the constitution and the nature and human nature, right? We are all essentially the same in terms of the elements. We all have a physical body that is represented by earth. Our bodies are all full of water. We all have life breath. We all have metabolism, right? All that. And the same thing is true on the psycho-spiritual level. Again, or actually, what I meant to say was, we have the physical body, which can be represented, the entire physical body, which can be represented by earth, and then we can also represent the mind and the emotions and the spirit and the sense of self with the elements as well. And so, in this sense, all humans are essentially the same. Which faculties are more awakened in us, which we rely on more vary, and the exact nature of those faculties varies. But we all have minds, we all have emotions, we all have bodies, we all have an unconscious, we all have a will, right? So in the diagram on the right is more like the constitution of the human body, right? This is on the tree of life and the elements on the tree. We talked about this in more detail in the recent class series on the Sephiroth, so you can look at that for more details on that. But I think one really helpful way of thinking about, again, the constitution of the human self, as represented by the elements, is the elements on the bottom half of the tree. So again, Malkuth is here like attributed to the element of earth, and this is the physical body. Yesod here is air, and you can think of this in a few different ways. I don't know that there's one kind of right answer and one right way to think about this, but we often talk about the subconscious mind as being air and as being like Yesod, and of course Yesod is attributed to the moon, or the moon is attributed to Yesod, and so that has that sense of like the unconscious and also the receptive self. The animal nature, the nefesh in Kabbalistic terms is all Yesod and is related to the element of air. Now, one thing that I think is a point of confusion, and again, there's no exact right or wrong answer, and some things may be more appropriate in different contexts, but sometimes people talk about air as the intellect, or as the mind, and I think that is a little bit misleading. And I think partially this also just varies with what we mean by intellect and what we mean by mind. I like to think of air as thoughts, And the actual thoughts themselves are airy. And if you've ever done any meditation, you think, oh, but my thoughts are conscious. I consciously create my thoughts. But if you've done meditation, you may realize that that's not exactly the case. Thoughts seem to arise on their own, and it's not clear where they come from. We don't choose. You can direct attention, but you don't really create your thoughts. Your thoughts appear to you, and thoughts, right, you have a thought, right? A thought comes up, and it's not exactly clear where those things arise from. While thoughts and maybe reason and the process of like logical analysis, that could be air, we tend to think of the mind and the intellect itself as being attributed to water and Hod. And of course, part of this is appropriate because Mercury is attributed to Hod. And as we'll see, Hod and the element of water is also attributed to the cup. And there's the sense of the human intellect as a vessel or as a container. And then in this metaphor, the water inside of the cup is like the unformed sort of thought stuff, what in the Indian tradition is called the chitta, the sort of thought substance that is contained and given form by the intellect. And then for fire and for Netzach, of course, Netzach is attributed Venus, and so we can think about desire here, right? Desire, passion, and also things like will. Not will like in the sense of true will, but in the more normal sense of or the more standard sense of will. Could all be attributed to Netzach. And then to Tefereth, in this context, we would attribute spirit as that which is beyond the human personality. So that the lower four, volition is a good word for Netzach, what was it? Right, so that the lower four Sephiroth, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, and Malkuth. Now we don't, necessarily teach anything definite, and we don't require people to believe anything in particular about reincarnation. But it's a nice way of thinking about this. That the lower four Sephiroth would be like what does not reincarnate. That's the individual human person, that ends at death. But Tefereth and above is that which, well, at least Tefereth, what's above becomes increasingly like impersonal and universal. But we can think of Tefereth as like the thing that reincarnates, right? The thing that is never born and never dies, and that incarnates as various, individual, persons. Okay, and then we also have the elements as a temperament and as right, as like human nature, and so we say that a person might be, like this person is particularly fiery, or this person is particularly earthy, and some of this is actually, fiery, earthy. Some of these things are actually in our common language. Maybe we don't say airy or watery, but we certainly talk about people being earthy or fiery. But so this is about a temperament and about a quality, not about the constitution. A person who's fiery doesn't have like more Netzach or more volition than other people. It's about a personality and a way of behaving. And it may be also about which faculties they tend to rely on. Some people tend to be more relying on their intellects, where other people are more physical, more bodily, more rooted in immediate experience. And so one classical way of talking about this is temperament. And temperament is interesting because it's not just personality. It also includes things about the body and about the natures of the body. And it's used in medicine, classical, like pre-modern medicine, and it has a lot of applications. Imbalances in different directions of like hot, wet, cold, and dry. Those could be diagnosed and then treated by different procedures. And of course, magical and ritual procedures could work here as well. Actually, that's a funny. I was just about to say that. Very good. And actually, it was used that in the Ayurvedic system. You have the three dashas. and I'm not just incredibly familiar with the Ayurvedic system, but these 4 temperaments here of sanguine, choleric, melancholic, and phlegmatic were used in very similar ways, and even for dietary adjustments as well. If you were being sort of like overly hot, you would avoid hot foods, or if you needed to add more heat into your life, you could add foods that were hot or wet or cold or dry. So it is very similar and has a very similar application. I think the reason that Westerners tend to pick up Ayurveda rather than a more classically like Western a tradition here is that the Ayurvedic tradition never died out, whereas the Western tradition has been kind of broken and parts of it have been lost, for the last few centuries. So looking to the Ayurvedic as a way of connecting to like a living version of this tradition can be very helpful. But there is a Western equivalent to that. Okay, so now this idea of the 4 temperaments goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks and to Hippocrates, one of the founders of traditional medicine, and is really developed by Galen, the Roman physician and author. And so these 4 temperaments, sanguine, choleric, melancholic, and phlegmatic, originally these are named after a physical theory of the 4 humors in the body. Like the sanguine corresponds with blood, the choleric corresponds with yellow bile, melancholic with black bile, and then phlegmatic corresponds with phlegm. And so the idea was that having an imbalance in any one direction was actually having more or less of those particular bodily substances. We know, of course, that that's not literally true. But that doesn't mean that this theory can't still work, both for talking about the body and talking about health and talking about something closer to personality. It's not exactly personality. Temperament would be something that was inherent and inborn. So like in the idea of like nature versus nurture, temperament would be all nature and not nurture. So while personality is shaped by events and how you're raised and schooling and all that sort of stuff, the idea of temperament would be something more innate. And so the 4 temperaments share with the elements being a combination of the same qualities of hot, wet, cold, and dry. So the sanguine temperament is said to be hot and wet, right? So it's not exactly the same as air, but it corresponds to air. And these temperaments also play a big role in traditional astrology as well and are helpful for thinking about astrology. So in traditional astrology, the planet Jupiter is sanguine. Jupiter is said to be hot and wet. And so if we think about like what Jupiter and what a Jupiterian type is, a lot of that is sanguine, right? Of being cheerful, active, social. The hot and wet is in the sanguine temperament is the most fertile, right? So hot has that activity and life and starting things up, and the wet has that fertility and union and bringing things together. So the sanguine temperament would seem to be the most fertile. And then the choleric is hot and dry. So in astrology, the planet Mars is extremely choleric, is extremely hot and dry, and the sun was moderately hot and dry. So both the sun and Mars are both choleric, but Mars is extremely so. The choleric temperament, is often said to be quite martial in nature, can be, hot, impulsive, fast. Extreme choleric temperament can be, like aggressive or combative, though a more balanced version, of the choleric is active, can get a lot done, engages, goes out into the world, all that sort of stuff. The melancholic temperament is cold and dry. And of course, this is where we get the word melancholy. And condition of melancholy is like the precursor to what we now call depression. Though the melancholic temperament encompasses a lot more than just being depressed, right? And so that the melancholic temperament it has the nature of Saturn. And Saturn is extremely melancholic. Saturn is extremely cold and dry. People tend to be more structured, more disciplined. Industrious is one that comes up a lot. The melancholic temperament. People of the melancholic temperament were always said to know how to work and how to labor very consistently, right? Let's see. let's see, you said, do we miss out the explanation for Hode? I think I mentioned Hode a little bit there. I was saying that Hode is like the intellect and the mind in the sense of a container for the thought stuff. So it's like the mind or the intellect as opposed to the thoughts or like the content, or also like the unconscious. Let's see, Pakem suggesting Neptune. Yeah, so I mean, of course, I'm talking about more like traditional astrology, but prior to the discovery of Neptune. But Neptune is certainly wet and corresponds closely with water. Let's see, I see a few more comments coming in. I'll just finish this and then I'll come up to the comments. Okay, so right, melancholic, cold, dry, industrious, of the nature of Saturn, and then finally the phlegmatic is cold and wet, and so that that would correspond to water, of course. In astrology, the moon is phlegmatic, and Venus is sometimes said to be phlegmatic. So some of the ancient authors disagree about whether Venus is cold or warm, and sometimes that will actually vary based on Venus's synodic cycle, like whether she's a morning star or an evening star, so whether she's warm or cold. But the moon is always given as phlegmatic. Phlegmatic people, I consider myself to be a phlegmatic person. My astrological chart bears that out, and I think the descriptions of the phlegmatic temperament describe me. And in some traditional sources, the phlegmatic temperament kind of gets the short end of the stick. They're often described as lazy and passive, which I certainly recognize those tendencies in myself. But I think being more fair to the phlegmatic temperament, you can see that phlegmatic people tend to be reflective, receptive, often intellectual. Can be phlegmatic, right? Because water has that receptive nature and the reflective nature too. I mean, water literally, the surface of water literally reflects, and so that reflective quality comes in. These four temperaments also correspond with the seasons, and you can see in the illustration there that I have on the left, the zodiac signs are arranged around the outside, and so we see Aries, Taurus, and Gemini correspond to the sanguine, and so this would be like the sun placement, and so this is spring. While the sun is in those three signs, it's the springtime, and so springtime is hot and wet traditionally, and it's also fertile. This is when new plants are arising and new life is coming. Animals are breeding and giving birth. Right, this is all during the springtime. Then summer, when the sun is in Cancer, Leo, and Virgo, this is the choleric times. The summer tends to be hot and dry. Then in the fall, this is melancholic, where this is sun in Libra, Virgo, and Sagittarius. And so again, things start to dry, to cool off, right? So it's that dryness from summer persists, but we're now starting to cool down. And then in winter, when the sun is in Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces, this is the phlegmatic and corresponds with water. So we've now added moisture. And so again, we can see that this revolving quality. In each season, one of the qualities remains and one changes. And so again, we transition from winter to spring. The wet quality remains, but we're warming up. And then this also corresponds with the moon's phases as well. The new moon and like the first quarter of the moon corresponds to the sanguine temperature and to spring. From first quarter to full moon is choleric. And then the third quarter, from full moon to waning half moon is melancholic. And then finally, the final quarter to the new moon is phlegmatic. Let's see. So yeah, let me scroll back here to a couple of the comments that have come in. Let's see. Let's see, Stephen says, I know we have to be flexible in these matters, but I still have a hard time with the situational nature of the elemental and planetary attributes as against the tree of life, i.e. how they are a number of different attributions and how they all disagree. Yeah, that's a tricky one. And I think situational, is the key word. That the elements, because we're not tied to them being like very specific substances. Anything can be attributed to the elements, and anything could be broken down and classified by the elements. So essentially, the elements are like a fourfold division of anything that you're looking at, and so right, it's situational. It's based on context, perspective, and where we're coming from. And yeah, I mean, part of that is of course like some of the sort of more modern perspective on these things, like I've been talking about. But yeah, it is difficult, and I think some of the confusion though comes from writers who are, I think, inappropriately crossing the boundaries between a more like way of talking about like temperament and talking about the actual like constitution, so that the way that like a phlegmatic person is, that's not necessarily what water is. If that makes sense, that it is important to keep those contexts straight. And I think a lot of the confusion comes up because of like mixing and matching between different contexts. Where if we're clear about context and about situation, I think things are clearer. I also think there's a lot of, like I was mentioning, I think uses of words like mind and intellect, and the worst one of all is emotion. People will talk about like water as emotions, but it's really not clear to me that like emotions are really like a good category of thing at all. I don't know that desire is really like the same thing as sadness or something like that, or that anger and happiness or something like that are the same, or that love and you know what I mean? I think some of those things are fiery, some of them are watery, some of them are airy. So I think it also has to do with some of the vague and imprecise like psychological terms that we use. Let's see, David's noting that Crowley's remarks in regard to the tarot regarding cocktails, like Netzach has a fiery dimension but isn't equal to fire, right? And that's the thing. I think that when we're talking about at least in the way we tend to talk, when we're talking about the elements as like the constitution, they're bringing in like Sephirotic significance and planetary significance as well. The fact that Netzach is Venus and Hod is Mercury and Yesod is the moon, that's all very relevant to the way that we think about the elemental constitution of the individual. So right, it's not like a pure application of the elements exactly. Okay, and like I said, I'm going to be leading a class series on planetary magic, and we'll do some astrology and stuff, so we can come back to these same ideas in an astrological context. It's also worth saying, about especially about temperament and things like that, that people aren't simply one, and you can be more or less. The herbalist Nicholas Culpeper developed a theory of like primary and secondary temperaments, and you can be more or less like balanced as well. So like I think of myself as basically a phlegmatic person, but fairly well balanced. I'm not extremely phlegmatic, but I tend to be somewhat cold and somewhat wet, both in my personality and in my body as well. I have trouble if I'm feeling like dry, especially like in the summers here in Sacramento. That can be hard, feeling like dried out. And I really feel the need to go to water and be near water. And I feel very balanced by that, by being in cooler and wetter environments. And that's a part of it too. Like what sort of environments you feel comfortable in may give you also clues about your temperament. And sometimes that you maybe feel more comfortable in an environment that matches your temperament, but especially if you tend towards like an extreme or another, you may actually feel better in an environment that helps to balance out your temperament and gives you some of the pieces that, tends to bring your temperament back towards neutral. But there's no one single standard, and absolute balance isn't like better. It's all very much relative to the individual. So you have your basic kind of nature and constitution, and then that can vary based on circumstances. And so feeling health and well-being tends to be, back to your closer to your like original basic characteristic, rather than whatever modification events and circumstances have created for you. All right. So I want to return to the idea of microcosm and macrocosm, that we've talked about already, and some more of the symbolism. And some of this will kind of bridge into the upcoming class series that we'll be starting in January on planetary magic and hexagram rituals. So again, we have the microcosm, in the geocentric cosmology that you see there on the left. We have the microcosm as the elemental world, and the macrocosm as the celestial world. And we talked about how that gets modified with the heliocentric cosmology, but it's still a useful reference point for a lot of this symbolism. And so the microcosm is those four elements that we talked about, right? But then we also talked about the microcosm as symbolized by the pentagram, and the human body symbolized by the pentagram. So again, we have this 4 and the 5 and the relationship between those two things. So with the microcosm, the pentagram in the elements are the symbol of the microcosm. The hexagram is the symbol of the macrocosm. And so in Crowley's work, the union of the microcosm and the macrocosm, which is symbolized as 5 plus 6, right? The pentagram is obviously 5, the hexagram is obviously 6. The addition of those things yields 11, which is the number of the great work. So, in this workshop today, we're focusing on microcosmic forces, and that in terms of like the great work, that's half of the story, and we also have all those ideas about the microcosm mirroring the macrocosm, and certainly in the training and development of a magician, it's important to start with the microcosmic forces and to really develop those before moving on to the macrocosm. So, partially, I'm just pointing the way forward to more advanced that. Doing pentagram rituals and elemental magic gives you the foundation and basis for being able to do planetary magic and working with macrocosmic forces. And again, this double kind of way that the microcosm and macrocosm works, where it's above and below, the elemental and the celestial, but also within and without, the individual and the whole. All right, so shifting gears here a little bit. So we saw the tetragrammaton, and now we're going to talk about the transformation of the tetragrammaton into the pentagrammaton. So the pentagrammaton, the 5-lettered name, was developed by one of the early Kabbalists, Johann Reuchlin. He's a little after Pico, but he's one of the earliest and one of the most important. And so in Pico della Mirandola, who's really like the first Christian Kabbalist, at least that we have names for, there were certainly some earlier ones, especially of like Jewish converts to Christianity. But in terms of our like tradition, Pico is really the beginning of it in terms of what we have documentation for. So Reuchlin was following after Pico. And something Pico worked on was a Kabbalistic spelling of the name Jesus. And so we're not going to talk about what Pico's solution to it was, but he used a 3-lettered name. But Reuchlin sort of didn't accept that and didn't think that it was didn't think that it was correct. And so what Reuchlin did was spell the name by modifying the tetragrammaton. Now, if the pentagrammaton seems like an odd spelling of the name Jesus, it's important to remember that Jesus is like an English version of a Latin version of a Greek version of a like Hebrew or Aramaic name, which would more directly translated in English would be Joshua, or right, which is in Hebrew or Aramaic is something like Yeshua. So that's the name they're trying to come up with a Kabbalistic spelling of. Right, yep, and Maria just put that there, Yeshua. So what Reuchlin does is he takes the tetragrammaton, Yod He Vav He, and tetragrammaton, of course, literally means 4-lettered name. That tetra is 4. So the 4-lettered name, Yod He Vav He, and he inserts into the middle of it the letter Shin. And Shin is associated with the idea of spirit. So now into the middle of the tetragrammaton, the spirit has descended, and we now have a 5-lettered name, which is the pentagrammaton, Yod He Shin Vav He. And so for our tradition, coming after Christian Kabbalah, we have Hermetic Kabbalah, which continues to use the pentagrammaton as an important formula, but no longer associates it, with the person of Jesus. So we continue to use it as an important formula, but don't associate it with that particular individual, but rather as a formula for the 5 elements rather than as a formula for the 4 elements. And that's something, I don't know if I mentioned that in the first half of the class with the tetragrammaton. While it is, of course, a divine name and one of the most important divine names, it is perhaps more importantly a formula for magic. And I think it's no coincidence that it's a formula and a divine name. That's not like an accidental thing. But so the pentagrammaton is, again, a divine name and a formula for magical work. Yeah, and I imagine that Reuchlin was thinking about that. Yeah, that's a really good observation, David. I haven't actually read his works directly, but yeah, I imagine that was something that he was thinking about when he formulated this. All right, so now we have the pentagrammaton. So the yod he vav he, remains exactly the same as it was, and now sheen, as I'm sure is obvious, is now attributed to spirit. Yeah. So pretty straightforward. We've just added spirit into the middle of the elements. And I think it is important that spirit is in the middle rather than at like the beginning or at the end, that spirit has like descended into the midst of matter and is here in the midst of the world and within, us and within all things. I like that part of the symbolism. Let's see, Mari's pointing out that sheen, can be attributed to fire, and that is true, but that's not the correspondence that's relevant for the pentagrammaton. This is another one of those sort of situational sort of things. Like in the scheme of the whole 22 letters, the letter yod corresponds to Virgo, but in the tetragrammaton, it corresponds to fire, right? And obviously we have he. I mean, this letter is here twice, and once it's corresponding to water, and once it's corresponding to earth, right? So this is again a kind of situational thing. So in the context of the pentagrammaton, sheen corresponds to spirit, whereas in the full alphabet, in the full alphabet, it corresponds with fire and spirit, but primarily spirit. So another place, to just be clear about the context in which we're using these letters and symbols. Yeah, that is an interesting thing, isn't it, Paco? Okay. So another later important Hermeticist, Kabbalist, and also alchemist. He was a follower of Paracelsus, contemporary of John Dee, and it's likely that he and John Dee actually met, is Heinrich Kunrath. And so this is a plate from his book, The Amphitheater of Eternal Wisdom. So there's a lot of stuff going on in this diagram that we don't have time to talk about. But I wanted you to notice in the center of this here, there's Christ there in the center. But again, especially with a more esoteric understanding of Christian mysticism, Christ becomes kind of like the cosmic human, a bit like the Greek or Hermetic or Gnostic idea of like the anthropos. So we can really work with these symbols even without, understanding them in a purely Christian way. And so we see Christ in the center, and arranged around the outside, we see the pentagrammaton. So we've got the yod here, and then he, and then sheen, and vow, and he. And so they're in order from right to left, which is the direction that Hebrew is written. And we've just sort of started at the lower right and gone around in the order that Hebrew is written. So it's a bit like we saw earlier with the pentagram from Agrippa, where he starts in the lower left and goes in order. I think starting at the bottom and going around just sort of makes an intuitive sense. But Hebrew is read right to left, so we're going counterclockwise. There's a lot of other interesting things going on in this diagram too, but I'm just trying to point out this one thing here. So I don't know that this exactly is the origin, but I think it's likely for the attributions of the pentagram, either directly from Reuchlin or someone else that from Kunrath's image here, or someone that Kunrath influenced. And obviously, Kunrath is getting the pentagrammaton from Reuchlin's work. So if we superimpose a pentagram, onto that image, which is you can see on the left there, you'll see that the letters, of course, match up or line up with the points of the pentagram. And then I've abstracted that on the right, so you can see yod, he, sheen, vav, he arranged around the pentagram. And so now, if we remember back a couple slides before, in the elemental correspondences of the pentagram, or the pentagrammaton, we now have the elemental correspondences to the points of the pentagram. This is an interesting, this is something that doesn't get talked about a lot, about why the pentagram is attributed, not even just with this diagram, but even the idea that it's like the spelling of the pentagrammaton, just in order, counterclockwise, is something that isn't talked about a lot. And I've heard people express, that they have difficulty working with pentagram rituals because they couldn't understand, why the pentagrams are drawn in the way they are and why the points are attributed in the way that they are. And this seems to be the reason. Yeah, so there you go. You got your elemental correspondences to the points of the pentagram. So we still need to build up a few more concepts before we can get into to invoking and working with specific elements. So another thing that's going to happen here is that we're going to differentiate two modes of spirit. This, we're not saying that there's two forms of spirit or that there's like two different quintessences. It's more, yeah, it's like, I think mode is a helpful word. And so it's spirit kind of differentiated into active and passive. So again, we have the four elements divided up into active and passive, right? We have fire and air, the active elements, and then water and earth, the passive elements. And now we have two forms of spirit that correspond to each. So we have spirit active and we have spirit passive. All right, so from here, we just need to now get the rules for how to draw and visualize our pentagrams. So we've got the elemental correspondences there, that we derived from the pentagrammaton, put onto the elements. We see spirit at the top, and then air and water on horizontal, and then earth and fire at the bottom. So we're going to end up. We're going to have a banishing and an invoking form for each element, and for spirit active and passive. So what this is going to mean is, since you have the four elements plus the two modes of spirit, that's 6, and then banishing and invoking for each one, you'll essentially have 12 different pentagrams. But because the pentagram, only has 5 points, some of these are going to be the same, right? You can only really have 10 unique ways of drawing it, so there's going to be some overlap, which can be a point of confusion, but hopefully it'll be clear. All right, so the basic rules for how to draw these pentagrams. It makes sense to start with spirit and then to give the rules for the elements first, I think, just as a way of kind of logically laying it out. So the rules for spirit are pretty simple. So this is for spirit invoking or banishing, spirit active or passive. And so the rule is that the first line that you're going to draw is going to connect the two elements of the same mode as the type of spirit that you're invoking. So you'll notice that the two passive elements, earth and water, are connected by this line, this lower line here. And then the two active elements, fire and air, are connected by this line here, right? And so there's like a symmetry there, which works out very nicely. So whenever you're invoking spirit, your first line, if you're invoking spirit passive, this is going to be the first line that you're going to draw here. And if you're invoking spirit active, this is going to be the first line that you're going to draw here. And the rule is to invoke upwards and banish downwards. So if we are invoking spirit passive, we're going to start at the lower left point and move upwards and then continue all the way around until we get back to that point, right? So this would be an invoking spirit passive pentagram, right, like that. And then if we were invoking spirit active, we would start at the lower point here and do the same thing and move all the way around. And now to banish, we're banishing downwards. So if you're banishing spirit passive, you would start here and move downwards and then continue all the way around. And if you were invoking spirit active, you would start here and move downwards and continue all the way around. So that's it. Those are the 4 forms of spirit pentagrams. Now for the 4 elements, the rule is a little bit different. The rule is invoke towards and banish away. So you're invoking towards the element. You're invoking towards the element that you're working with, rather than it being about up or down. So if you're invoking now, there's 2 different ways that you could do this, because each point is connected by 2 different lines. Please see plain invoking. I'm not sure what you mean, Maria. Maybe you could clarify. I'm not sure what you're talking about there. Right. So the rule is invoke towards the element that you want to invoke, or draw your line towards the element that you want to invoke and banish away from it. And so there's obviously two different ways that you could do this. So if you wanted to, let's say, invoke earth, you could obviously start here and move towards, or you could start here and move towards it. But if you just remember that none of the elemental pentagrams will duplicate the spirit pentagrams, right, then you'll know that you would have to start here and move downwards. Because if you started here, that would duplicate like a banishing spirit passive pentagram. Let's see, so you're saying what is active or passive spirit? You mean what does that mean? Or like which pentagram is which? It's the simple idea, it's not a particularly important like conceptual idea. It's just two different ways of invoking spirit for different purposes. Once we get to the greater ritual of the pentagram, you'll see how it's used. So it's not an extremely important conceptual idea. One way that I like to think about it is as like the first step towards differentiation into the elements. If you think that the four elements like emerge out of spirit, spirit active is like moving towards the active elements, and spirit passive is like differentiating towards the passive elements. But again, they're much more important for practical purposes than for like theoretical or philosophical purposes. So yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about it. And I think once you actually start working with these rituals, you'll get a sense of how they function and how they feel differently. Yeah. And again, I think it'll become clear the practical usage of them as we go on. All right. So I'll give you examples of some of these pentagrams. So to invoke earth, we know that we're going to invoke towards earth, but we're not going to duplicate any of the spirit pentagrams. So we'll start at the top and we'll move down to the lower left, and then we'll continue all the way around. If we were going to invoke fire, we would start at the top and move down towards fire. If we were going to banish fire, if you're banishing, you start at the point attributed to that element. So if you're banishing fire, you're going to start at the fire point, and then you're going to move away, but not duplicating the spirit pentagram, so you'll move up and move around. Now, where the overlap comes in is that you can see that beginning at the air point and moving away, that could be either moving towards water, which would be invoking water, or it could be banishing air, which is moving away from air. So the banishing air pentagram and the invoking water pentagram are going to be drawn in the same way. And then the reverse is also true. The banishing water pentagram is drawn identically to the invoking air pentagram. But the reason they're not actually the same is, one, because of your intention, and two, because of the visualizations. So when you're drawing these pentagrams, you're visualizing like a field. I just imagine it, rather than being in a particular place, I just imagine a saturated color sort of completely filling my field of vision. And then you're going to draw the pentagram, you're going to visualize the pentagram on top of that in the complementary color, which is exactly the colors that we've been looking at all the way through the workshop today. So for both of the spirit pentagrams, active and passive, you're imagining a white field because that's the color of spirit, and you're drawing the pentagram on top of that in black, which is the opposite color to white. And for fire, you're imagining a red field and drawing your pentagram on top of it in green. For water, a blue field, pentagram on top in orange. For air, yellow pentagram yellow field with a violet pentagram. And then for earth, a black field with a white pentagram. And so you can see that the difference between, for example, an invoking air pentagram and a banishing water pentagram is that the air pentagram will be drawn on a violet and a yellow background, and the water pentagram will be drawn in orange on a blue background. So although just watching someone do it in the air, you couldn't necessarily tell which one was which, in practice, they will be different. Yeah, so that's the basic rules. It's easy to get confused with this, especially if you're if you're new to this, and I still get mixed up occasionally. But if you just kind of think through the basic attributions and the logic behind all of these things, it should be easy to figure out. And in practice, you can review whichever one you're doing just before you start, and then you'll start to learn it as you as you start working with them more. Oh, right. So thanks, Becca. So people suggesting a fiery blue for the pentagrams. So that's for the generic pentagram. So in the lesser ritual of the pentagram, you're just imagining a kind of electric blue pentagram, but not on any particular colored background. And so that's the pentagram for the generalized microcosmic force. You're not using the color visualizations to differentiate it into one of the elements or the other. These particular colored pentagrams on the colored backgrounds are used for specifying a particular element. But that fiery blue is just for, at least the way we teach it, is only for the general version of the pentagram used in the lesser ritual. And so that is the way that we differentiate between that generalized microcosmic force in the lesser ritual and like an invoking earth pentagram. Although they're like a general invoking pentagram and an invoking earth pentagram are both drawn by starting at the top point and moving down to the lower left. The general version is just that electric fiery blue color, not on any particular background, whereas an invoking earth pentagram is a white pentagram on a black background. So that's how that differentiation happens as well. Yeah, these visualizations are for the greater ritual or for any other. I mean, the greater ritual really becomes kind of like a toolkit that can be used in lots of different contexts and for lots of different purposes. So the greater ritual is more like a rough template than a specific ritual. And you'll see, yeah, other rituals that use pentagrams. And you can draw pentagrams, on if you're charging a talisman or something like that, you'll draw pentagrams on top of them. But you can use these same rules for visualization and for drawing, no matter what you're doing with those pentagrams. And you can create your own rituals that involve elements and use these same pentagrams. So it is used for the greater ritual, but not exclusively so. And like I said, I think it's helpful to think of the greater ritual as more like a toolkit for elemental magic than as like a specific ritual. All right, so then we'll also need to add divine names for all of the elements before we can look at the greater ritual. So if you know your correspondences, or if you watched or attended the class series that we did on the paths, letters, and correspondences, you'll recognize all of these names here as the divine or absolutic names attributed to the elements. So the absolutic name of fire, and this would be like the divine name attributed to the 31st path, if you're looking in 777. That divine name is Elohim, so this is the divine name of fire. And then the divine name of water is El. The divine name of air is the tetragrammaton, Yod He Vav He, which again we're pronouncing as Yod He Vav He. That's how we teach it. And then the divine name for earth is Adonai. And then spirit active and spirit passive each have their own divine names. So for spirit passive, we have this Tarkon again of Aleph, Gimel, Lamed, Aleph, which we teach as to be pronounced the full phrase, Ata, Gibor, La'olam, Adonai. And then for spirit passive, or for spirit active, we have Eheye. So these are the divine names that you'll use for the greater ritual of the pentagram. And as I said, I'm happy to provide the slides for people so that you can have this as a reference for your own practice. Though you can also find it in Liber O or in any other source for those rituals. All right. So for doing the greater ritual of the pentagram. Oh, you get confused because of the divine names from the lesser ritual of the pentagram? Yeah, that is a point that a lot of people get confused about. I think it's important to remember that divine names being used in the lesser ritual of the pentagram are not elemental. Yeah, there's something else going on in the lesser ritual of the pentagram that I can't really get into here. But yeah, it's important to remember that those names are not being used for their elemental correspondences in the lesser version. But it's an easy thing to get mixed up about. So yeah, just be careful and take it slow, and you'll get the hang of it in practice. All right, so the structure of the greater ritual, the pentagram, is going to be essentially a modification of the lesser ritual. So, I mean, it makes good magical sense, but also good practical sense to really know the lesser ritual of the pentagram, know it really well and in depth. And then from that point, it's then easy just to make a few small changes to transform the lesser ritual into the greater ritual. So again, the structure of the lesser ritual that we saw earlier, I'm breaking up into this 4-part structure of the bookends of the Kabbalistic cross at the beginning and end, then the pentagrams around the circle, and then the invocation of the archangels into the quarters. And so the only structural difference is going to be the insertion of a spirit pentagram. But the thing that can be slightly confusing is that where the spirit pentagram gets inserted is different depending on whether you're invoking or whether you're banishing. So if you're invoking, the spirit pentagram comes immediately after the Kabbalistic cross, before you make the pentagrams in the quarters. And if you're banishing, the spirit pentagram comes after the invocation of the archangels. And so you can think of this also as something like a kind of bookend. Now, for practical purposes, if you're doing like a ritual working with the elements, you're going to, at the beginning of that working, or close to the beginning of that working, you're going to invoke. And then after you've done whatever specific purpose you're there to do, there's a meditation or charging a talisman or a Eucharistic ritual, whatever it is, when it's all closed and completed, then you're going to banish that element. So you'll use the greater invoking and the greater banishing in tandem. One to open an elemental working, and then one to close the working. And so if you remember that with the spirit pentagram, it's kind of like a last in, first out sort of principle. So I like to think of the spirit pentagram and the spirit here as something like a foundation for the elements. So if you're going to be doing say an invocation of fire, before you invoke fire, you want to set up a foundation of spirit active. And then sort of on top or within, or however you want to conceptualize it, that foundation of spirit active, then you'll invoke fire. And then when you're all done, then it's like this last in, first out. So first you'll banish fire, then you'll banish spirit. It's like building something, right? You've got spirit on the bottom, and then your specific element on top. And then when you go to take it back apart, you're going to take the top off first, and then the foundation. So that's how I like to think of it, and that's how it makes sense to me. Let's see, a couple questions coming in here. Let's see, Keith says, would divine names in lesser be another generalization, as the electric blue pentagram is also a generalized symbol of microcosmic force? Yeah, I mean, they certainly are general. But yeah, like I said, I'm not really going to, I can't really get into it here, unfortunately. So Pocket saying the lesser seems more microcosmic and elemental, whereas the greater seems more macrocosmic and astrological. Well, I mean, microcosm and macrocosm can vary a little bit, depending on context. But at least the way I'm using it in this context, this stuff is all microcosmic. It's just that the greater is more like specifically microcosmic, and the lesser is more general. In some ways, I don't know that lesser and greater are actually really very good or helpful words at all. The lesser ritual, the pentagram, is not in any way like inferior or less powerful than the greater. It's actually just more general, and the greater is more specific. So I mean, obviously that's what the tradition calls it, so that's what I continue to call it. But in some ways, I don't really love the use of lesser and greater. Yeah. All right. So that's the basic structure, and then now here are kind of the rules for transforming the lesser ritual into the greater ritual. So it's going to basically be like the lesser ritual, just with some differences. Now, again, there's no absolute one right way to do this, and different teachers sort of teach this in different ways. As I was saying, you can think of this as more like a kind of modular toolkit than like a specific ritual. But this is the way that we're teaching it here. So instead of facing east, like as the default, like you do in the lesser ritual, the way we're teaching here is to face the quarter of the element that you're targeting. So if you are doing an invocation of air, you'll start in the east, just like you would with the lesser. But if you're invoking one of the other three elements, you're going to begin facing one of the other quarters. So if you're invoking fire, you'll start off facing south, you'll do your Kabbalistic cross facing south, you'll do your spirit pentagram facing south, and then you'll begin your sequence of drawing the pentagrams in the quarters with the south. But you're always going to go clockwise. So if you're invoking fire, you'd start in the south, then draw a pentagram in the west, then in the north, then in the east, then return to the south, then you go back to the middle, invoke the archangels in the center, and then a Kabbalistic cross. And the invocation of the archangels and the Kabbalistic cross would all be done facing south if you were working with fire. So face the quarter of the target element. Now, in the quarters, now this is pretty simple. You're basically going to do exactly the same thing in all four quarters. You're going to draw whichever pentagram it is, with the visualized colors and everything, whatever pentagram it is, in all four quarters. And you're going to vibrate. You're going to draw the same pentagram and vibrate the same divine name in all four quarters. And then now you're adding that single spirit pentagram. This is done in the center, or if you're working in a smaller space and just sort of turning around on your axis rather than actually moving to the quarters, you'll just do the spirit pentagram facing whichever way you're beginning. So that'll be facing the direction of the target element as well. And again, that spirit pentagram is added before the elemental pentagrams when you're invoking, and it's added after the archangels when you're banishing. The one final complication here is that the four archangels always remain in their quarters, and you're always invoking all four archangels, even when you're working on a specific targeted element. But which archangel you're facing will be what's changed, and you'll always be facing the archangel that corresponds to the element that you're working with. And the invocation of the archangels always has the same pattern of before me, behind me, on my right hand, on my left hand. For about me flames the pentagram, and in the column shines the six-rayed star. It's just that which angel is before, behind, on your left and your right is changing depending on which quarter you're facing. So for another example, if you are invoking water, right, you're going to be facing west at the beginning and at the end. So you would say, when you return to the center, you'd raise your arms in the form of the cross, and you would say, before me, Gabriel, behind me, Raphael, on my right hand, Uriel, on my left hand, Michael. So the order of the angels is changing, but the before, behind, right, and left is not changing. Again, this can be a place of confusion, especially if you've really ingrained that sequence from the lesser ritual. So just take it slow, be careful, and it'll become more natural as you practice it. All right, so let's just do one example. So I'll show you one example. This will be for the greater invoking ritual of the pentagram of fire. So this is for invoking fire. So my voice is starting to go here a little bit. Let's see. So you're going to start. You want to go back to the angels? Okay. Sure. I'll give you another example. So if we're going to be invoking Earth, we would be facing north, right? We would start our ritual facing north. You'd be doing the Kabbalistic cross while facing north. Then you'd be doing say we're invoking Earth, right? So you do Kabbalistic cross facing north. Then you'd invoke the spirit passive pentagram, invoking spirit passive pentagram. Then you would move into the northern quarter. In the northern quarter, you would do your invoking pentagram of Earth, and you'd be using the divine name Adonai. And then you go to the east and do the same thing. You go to the south and do the same thing. Go to the west and do the same thing, and then complete your circle in the north. Then you return to the center of your ritual space, and you would be still facing north. You'd raise your arms, in the form of a cross. And you would say, before me, Uriel, behind me, Michael, on my right hand, Raphael, on my left hand, Gabriel, right? Because the elements, the angels have stayed in their quarters that they're attributed to. And you're still going before me, behind me, on my right hand, on my left hand. But it's just that your orientation is different. So the angels are in different quarters. Yeah, so I'm talking fast, and it is a lot to absorb. But again, I am happy to provide the slides with you for your provide the slides for you, for your study and for reference, because this is definitely something you're going to need to look up, every time you do it, at least for a while. All right, so here's an example of the greater invoking ritual of the pentagram of fire. So, like I said, you would, number one, you'd face south. You'd perform the Kabbalistic cross just the same as you always would, except that you're facing in a different direction. Now, staying in place in the center of your ritual space, facing south, you would draw the invoking spirit active pentagram. So this would be a black pentagram on a white background, and you would be vibrating the divine name Eheye, which is the divine name attributed to spirit active. And then you would move to the south if you're actually moving around the ritual space, or just stay in place if you're just going to be rotating in place. All right, and then you're going to draw the invoking fire pentagram. So that is a pentagram, starting in at the top and moving down to the right, and then continuing all the way around. And you're visualizing that as a green pentagram against a red background. And then you're vibrating, you're pointing your implement to the center. All those little details are all the same as in the lesser ritual of pentagram. You're pointing, the implement towards the center, optionally taking a small step forward, and then you're vibrating the divine name Elohim, right, which is the divine name attributed to fire. Now you're moving to the west, and tracing that arc of the circle, and both for the, I don't know if I mentioned that before, but both in the greater and lesser versions of it, you should visualize, that the line of the circle being traced, and that circle kind of intersects with the center of the 4 pentagrams that you're drawing. For the lesser ritual, that circle is that same like general electric blue color as you're drawing the pentagrams, and here it would be the same color that you're again drawing the pentagrams. So in this particular instance, the circle you're drawing is a green circle against a red background. Right, so we've started in the south, and now we've moved counterclockwise, we've moved clockwise to the west, and trace that arc of the circle. And now we're just going to repeat steps 6 and 7. So again, we'll draw the same invoking fire pentagram, green on a red background, vibrate Elohim. Then we'll trace our circle to the north. Draw that spirit pentagram, fire pentagram, and vibrate Elohim. Then we'll go to the east, again, tracing the arc of the circle. We will draw our invoking fire pentagram, vibrate Elohim. And then finally, we'll connect our circle back up to where we started in the south. Then we'll return to the center of our space, and we'll be facing south still. And we'll extend our arms in the form of a cross. And we'll say, before me, Michael, behind me, Uriel, on my right hand, Gabriel, on my left hand, Raphael. And of course, you're vibrating the names of the archangels, just like you always would. And then for about me flames the pentagram, and in the column shines the 6-rayed star, just like always. And then you would perform the Kabbalistic cross again. So hopefully that example is helpful, and from that you should be able to figure out how to do any of the others. Obviously the banishing ritual of the pentagram of fire would be extremely similar. The only difference would be that you would be drawing the pentagrams, differently. You'd be starting at the lower right point and moving up to the top, right? Because it's the banishing form of the fire pentagram, and the banishing spirit active pentagram would come just before the final Kabbalistic cross, rather than towards the beginning. Yeah, it's interesting. When I first started doing the greater ritual of the pentagram, it felt really strange to me that the archangels of the other elements should be present. I was thinking, if I'm invoking fire, like what are Uriel, Gabriel, and Raphael doing there? And I encourage you just to sort of experiment with it and see how it feels. Yeah, I encourage you to just see how it feels and see how the archangels appear. Yeah, that's something that I've kind of worked out in practice, and I just encourage you to do the same and to pay attention to how the presence of the different archangels changes depending on which element is present in the temple at the time. Yeah. Oh yeah, Stephen, I'm really glad that you asked that question. Actually, yeah, you definitely want to start with the LBRP before doing a specific invoking. Yeah, I didn't think to mention that. Thank you. Yeah, and the reason for that, is both to center yourself, to balance yourself, and also to clear, to make sure that there's no other forces kind of like hanging around in your ritual space. If you were nothing bad is going to happen. There's nothing need to be. There's no need to be like fearful or anything like that about it. But one thing that could happen would be if there's some energy, sort of latent either in the space or in you, and then you do an invoking ritual without banishing first, and then you do like a meditation or something like that. You could end up picking up other things that are present in addition to whatever you've invoked. Invoking is bringing something in, but it doesn't get rid of things that are already there. We don't necessarily have to think of banishing as necessarily like getting rid of everything, but as more like returning something to a neutral state. So it's like balancing or like sterilizing too. A friend of mine used to always say that about, because I've seen some people that don't like banishing, some kind of like chaos magic type people who will be like, oh yeah, I never banish sort of ever. And he was saying, that's like, doing chemistry and never like sterilizing your lab equipment. Or yeah, like palate cleansing. Yeah, that's a good metaphor too. I like that. So part of it is just about working this sort of method of science idea. We want to make sure that if we're invoking fire and meditating on the nature of fire, we don't have other things interfering and potentially like misleading us, right? And of course, if we're also bringing in power and force, it's nice to have balanced ourselves first, so that energy can be processed or handled in a more safe and healthy and constructive sort of way. Though again, there's no need to be fearful or superstitious about that or anything. All right, so actually, I'm going to skip this for a minute and come back. Let's talk about something else, and then I'll come back and add something else. But I want to give you a little bit of a palate cleanser before adding any additional complications here. Yeah, I know that was a lot and rather quick. But again, the recording will be available, and I'm happy to share slides with people. All right, so I want to mention a few other things with the remaining hour that we have left here, or 50 minutes that we have here, about some other principles for elemental magic and about the nature of the elements in general. And so I was thinking about, including like correspondences to the elements here and like ritual correspondences, but because the elements are so microcosmic and so not necessarily physical, but so close to the physical elemental like world or the world of Messiah, like we've been talking about. Again, not that they don't have yet sporadic and higher correspondences or components, but I think it doesn't make quite as much sense to think about, like for doing if you're doing planetary magic, for example, using different like plants and stones that correspond to the planets makes a lot of sense. But using like plants and stones that correspond to the elements doesn't make as much sense. And those types of, because the elements are already so physical, or so close to the physical. And classically, that's something you won't find. Like you won't find in Agrippa or whatever, the idea of like stones that correspond to the elements. You will find that in 777, though it's just not as much of a part of the traditional conception of magic. But one thing that you can use if you want to add like physical emblems of the elements into your ritual space and work with them, and this is a nice way to work with the elements, is to work with Eucharistic formula. So, oh yeah, and actually this will make a nice transition back into what I just skipped over. So Crowley, in the chapter in book 4 about Eucharist, he goes through a series of Eucharists of different number of elements. So the 4 and the 5 are both relevant for this discussion today. So he says that the Eucharist of 4 elements consists of fire, air, water, and earth. These are represented by a flame for fire, by incense or roses for air, by wine for water, and by bread and salt for earth. Right? So this should be pretty obvious. The Eucharist of 4 elements is the Eucharist of the 4 elements. Now for fire is represented by a flame. This could be a candle or like an oil burning lamp or something, anything that produces a flame. And so this is not something that corresponds to fire, but actually literally is fire. You'll have actual fire, on your altar or in your ritual space. And now Eucharist, of course, is something that is consumed, right? But you're not going to like swallow fire, unless you're trained at that, I suppose, right? Fire swallowers. But the idea here that you could experience the element as a kind of like partaking in the Eucharist of that, and partaking in that element's nature. So for fire, obviously there's the visual impression of it, but also the feeling of the warmth of it is like a partaking in fire and in contacting the element of fire. Now for air, we have things that have a scent, right? So roses or incense are both things that have a scent, right? And so that's like the element of air is the scent. And obviously incense is much more kind of literal here, I think. It literally produces something in the air, and you can see the smoke rising up from it. And then Crowley says wine for water. Yeah, and that works great. You could also just use water for water. That would also be perfectly appropriate. And then the traditional Eucharist for earth is bread and salt. Salt, of course, is a correspondence of earth. The salt crystals are even cubical in shape, and the cube corresponds to earth. And bread is made of grains, which also are very, obviously, grains, like all plants, like grow in the earth, but grains in particular are very associated with the element of earth and with the fertility of earth, and so they have a special representation to earth. And we'll actually see that in a little bit when we look at some more classical art relating to the elements. We'll see some grains associated with earth. All right, and then the Eucharist of 5 elements. Now Crowley gives here the 5 senses as attributed to the elements. So the Eucharist of 5 has wine for taste, rose for smell, a flame for sight, a bell for sound, and a dagger for touch. And he says this sacrament is implied in the Mass of the Phoenix in a slightly different form. And I just talked about the Mass of the Phoenix recently in that one-off class that I did last month on the nature of the sun and solar rituals in Thelema. So you can reference that there, or you can look up the Mass of the Phoenix on your own. And so that's like a Eucharist of 5 would be partaking in the 5 senses. Okay, so with that little palate cleanser, and also the idea of doing like a ritual that would involve of course you could do a ritual, a Eucharistic ritual for a single element, right? Like you could invoke just earth and then partake of bread and salt as a Eucharist for earth, but you can also partake of a Eucharist of like Crowley is suggesting there is a Eucharist of all 4 elements. Not at once, but in the same ritual, you're partaking of all 4 elements. So if you're doing that, you'd want to invoke the power of all 4 of the elements. Now you could use a lesser ritual just as a way of bringing in like a generalized macrocosmic force, but it's also possible to invoke. Now I was calling this a pentagram ritual to invoke spirit. You're also invoking all 4 of the elements as a way of getting at spirit. And this is kind of like, I like to think of this as a sort of magical equivalent to the alchemical process of extracting spirit from the 4 elements. So I'm just calling this a pentagram ritual to invoke spirit. When I did this class back in, or a similar version of this class back in like February and March, I was calling this the sort of in quotation marks, the supreme ritual of the pentagram. That language is a little bit confusing. There's a few different things that people call the supreme ritual of the pentagram, and I think it was confusing for people who knew other versions and more common versions. So I'm not using that terminology here. What this is here is something like a simplified kind of or like skeletal version of several different more advanced pentagram rituals. And the main versions of these would be like the preliminary invocation of the Goetia. Like that's in like the Crowley Mathers version of the Goetia. There's that preliminary invocation that's based on the acephalos rite, the headless rite or the bornless rite. And this has that same structure of invoking all the four elements, each in its own quarter, and then invoking spirit in the center. And then later in Crowley's life, he developed Liber Samekh, which was essentially a modification of that preliminary invocation of the Goetia. And it again has that same structure of invoking each element in its quarter and then returning to the center to invoke spirit. He also used that in Liber 5 as well. You also see it in the Golden Dawn, if you know the ritual called the Opening by Watchtower. That also uses a similar structure. And there's lots of elaborations that you can do. You can add in, like the Opening by Watchtower utilizes other spoken invocations. It uses Enochian. It utilizes the Enochian tablets, the elemental weapons, all sorts of other stuff. But it has this same basic shape. And so I think it makes a lot of sense to work with this earlier on. And then you can see things like Liber Samekh or Opening by Watchtower as more elaborate versions of this basic structure. So Gypsy's asking about before doing the Mass of the Phoenix, would you need to banish and invoke the 5 elements beforehand? No, I think the Mass of the Phoenix was designed to just be performed all by itself. You could try it and see if it feels any different, but I don't think that one is necessary. Banishing beforehand might be a good idea, but that one was really designed to be just kind of like a daily ritual. For a different purpose. So I wouldn't think it was absolutely necessary for that one. But yeah, banishing beforehand might be a good idea. But again, I think these are things that you can totally experiment with and see if they feel any different. And that may change as you go on. With some rituals, I found that like doing a lesser invocation ritual of the pentagram before doing something else was really helpful. But then at a certain point, I didn't really need to do that anymore. So your needs and preferences will also probably vary as you practice and develop skill. Yeah. Let's see. So this pentagram ritual to invoke spirit. So again, kind of like we did with the greater ritual of the pentagram, I'm suggesting this as like a modification of the lesser ritual. Now, in some ways, this is actually going to be a lot closer to the lesser ritual than the greater. There's no banishing form, so there's only one version of it. There would never be any reason to do a banishing here. And it has that kind of generalized quality where, unlike with a specific thing, you don't want to like invoke fire and then not banish because that will leave you in kind of an unbalanced state. Which is what you want. I mean, you want to be sort of unbalanced towards fire while doing a fire ritual, but you don't want to be in that state. You don't want to just stay in that state, and you certainly don't want to do that repeatedly. I've heard some bad stories about people who did things like that. Again, just no need to be fearful, but do be smart. So again, yeah, this is kind of generalized. You could almost think of this as like a high-powered version of the lesser invoking ritual of the pentagram. Okay, so basically a lesser invoking ritual of the pentagram, except that in the 4 quarters, you're going to invoke the specific elements. So in the East, you're going to draw, a violet pentagram against a yellow background, and you're going to use the invoking air form of it. So you're going to, move towards the air point of the pentagram, and you're going to vibrate the divine name of air, which is Yod He Vav He. And then in the South, you'll do an invoking fire pentagram. So green pentagram on a red background, starting at the top point, moving down to the lower right, and then vibrating the divine name Elohim. And then in the West, you'll invoke water, and then in the North, you'll invoke earth. And then still, for the For the ritual, you still want to draw the ritual circle. Since this is more generalized, the ritual circle could probably be that kind of like electric blue color again, or white, I suppose, would work as well. So you're invoking each element in its quarter, using the same principle as the greater ritual, but just doing a different one in each quarter as appropriate. Then after the invocations, you return to the center, facing east. And now before invoking the archangels, you're going to invoke spirit. And I recommend that you invoke both versions of spirit. The order I've usually seen this given as is active first and then passive afterwards. But that's something you could experiment with, reversing passive and active if you wanted to. I don't know any specific reason why it should be done that way, but that's the way I've seen it done. And then you just close with the Kabbalistic cross. And like I said, there's no banishing form. I suggest that you think of this as like a high-powered version of the lesser invoking ritual of the pentagram, where it has that generalized sense of invoking a generalized microcosmic force. But I've always found, and you may as well, that the results are more powerful than with the lesser invoking ritual of the pentagram. Though I would suggest that you practice the greater ritual first before you go on to doing this, because with the greater ritual you have more time to really like get into the mind. In addition to the external instructions, which divine names you're vibrating and how you're visualizing the pentagram, there's also subtler and more inner processes involved in doing invocation, and that's something you really have to learn by doing it. And so I think for training purposes, it makes a lot of sense to work with specific elements first. Learn how to invoke fire, learn how to invoke water, learn how to invoke air, learn how to invoke earth. But you don't need to learn those in any special order, but be able to do each one of those on their own by themselves. And then when you do this for ritual here that I'm suggesting to invoke spirit, you'll be really good at, and you'll have the inner capabilities for invoking each element. And that's important because you'll only have the one opportunity in each quarter to invoke each one of the elements, rather than doing that element in all 4 quarters. So it's more advanced for that reason as well, that you have a less of an opportunity to invoke each one, so you really have to get it right that one time that you do it. So that's another reason that it's more advanced. And so having done the greater ritual will give you that feeling for that. Let's see, so Maria is saying, can you give me an example of why you would invoke only one element? Sure. I think one of the best examples is just to learn about the elements. Something you could really do is just to learn about the elements and just to know about them. You could invoke each one of them, not on separate days or maybe with a few days in between, and then just in that space, that ritual space that you've invoked that element into, you could just meditate on the nature of the element. You could also do, like I said, a Eucharistic ritual to try to bring some of that element into you. And eventually, you might feel the need to invoke the rituals for different purposes. Maybe you feel that you just need some fire in your life, or that you need some water, or maybe you're feeling kind of ungrounded and want some more earth. So it could also be done as kind of like a therapeutic sort of thing. It could also be done for more advanced ritual magic, like talismans and things like that. You might want to make a talisman for a specific element, and in that case, you'd just be invoking one. But a big part of it, I think, is really just the training and the learning. Anything that I or any other author can say about the elements is always going to be secondary to your own understanding and direct experience. And invoking that one element in particular is the best way to get that experience. All right, so if anybody else has any other further questions, please feel free to jump in. But I've just got a couple of things that we want to get to in the last half hour here. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about the 4 and 5 elemental weapons. So there's 2 different ways that the elemental weapons can be visual or attributed, on the tree, and the way that they can be looked at. And this is important to avoid confusion here. So they're the more specifically elemental versions of these is what you're seeing on the left. And so this is, again, like kind of the lower 4 Sephiroth, plus Tefereth as spirit. And so these would be like the specific forms of the elemental weapons, like that you may be familiar with for the Golden Dawn. So right, so this is the earth pentacle, the air dagger, the water cup, and the fire wand. And then the lamp, which we'll talk about, is attributed to spirit. And there's also, I don't want to use the word macrocosmic, but there's also the 4 weapons on a much larger scale. And this is when Crowley's talking about the weapons, he's generally talking about them on this larger scale. And so that's what you can see on the right there. This is a diagram that if you attended the Sephiroth series that I did, you saw a few times before. So here the wand would be like the weapon of Hokmah, the cup would be the weapon of Binah, the dagger or sword would be the weapon of Ruach and of the letter Vav, and the whole like middle section of the tree, and then the disc or pentacle again would be Malkuth. And here in this version, the lamp would now be attributed to Kether and to the highest. So this is a different way of talking about the elements. So this is maybe a little bit confusing, like something like the macrocosmic version of the elements or the macrocosmic version of the elemental weapons. Another thing not to get confused about here is a few of these things also have generalized forms. So there are other versions of wands that are used for other specific purposes. I don't want to get into them now, but you might know some of these from like the Golden Dawn tradition. There are other wands. Similarly, there's also a Mars sword that's attributed to Gevera. That you just don't want to get those confused. And then there's also that generalized banishing dagger that we talked about at the beginning. Let's see, why Mara's saying, why is vow in Tefereth? I talk about that in a lot of detail in the Sephiroth series. I believe that was in the 4th class in that series. Those are up on YouTube. You can check those out where I give a more detailed explanation. I mean, that's a traditional thing. And it's really being attributed to from Hesed all the way down to the Yesod, that entire set. But vow is most particularly associated with Tefereth. And we can also think of this as the sun in this, right? So especially the version on the right here, we really have the part Sufim, where the Yod is the father, and He is the mother, Vow is the son, and then the He final is the daughter. And this also gets back to what we were talking a little bit earlier about the difference between the volatile and the fixed elements. You can see that the father and mother are the 2 volatile elements. And so they're also productive, right? The father and mother unite to produce both the son and the daughter. But yeah, you really want to look at like the parts of theme to really understand everything that's going on here. And also the Kabbalistic parts of the soul are important for understanding this too. But yeah, so I'm just connecting to that stuff. We don't have time to explain it all. All right, so let's talk about the elemental weapons. Now, the 4 elemental weapons of wand, cup, sword, and disc, my understanding and what the historical record seems to bear out is that these specific 4 weapons, although you can find examples of all 4 of these things being used in magical work, going way back into the tradition, as a specific set of 4 weapons, especially as attributed to the elements, it seems to be that this is modeled on the suits of the tarot or on the esoteric interpretation of the suits of the tarot that develops in like the late 18th into early 19th century. That's something I've talked about in some of my other class series as well. So that's interesting to know that the elemental weapons and the suits of the tarot are absolutely interrelated. So one way that we can talk about the elemental weapons is by looking at the 4 aces of the tarot. So the Ace of Wands is also one of the most pure example of the weapon of the wand and of the element of fire. So there you see the Ace of Wands from the Thoth deck, the deck that Crowley and Lady Frida Harris did together. You'll see that the wand there is made up of 10 yods. The letter Yod, which of course is the attributed to fire and the tetragrammaton, and arranged in the form of the tree of life. And so in the Book of Thoth, Crowley says about this card represents the essence of the element of fire in its inception. It is a solar phallic outburst of flame from which spring lightnings in every direction. It is the primordial energy of the divine manifesting in matter at so early a stage that it is not yet definitely formulated as will. So yeah, and you know that meditating on these tarot cards can be another really great way of working with the elements. You know, you can do a really nice, I think, meditation session of doing like a greater invoking ritual of the pentagram, you know, of fire, let's say, and then meditating on the Ace of Wands. That could be a nice way to connect yourself to that element, since the aces really represent the inception in the most pure and highest form of the elements. Yeah. So, and again, this is we're thinking especially of Hokmah here, and of fire, and of like the true will, something beyond just the personal, individual experience of that thing. All right, here we have the image of the Ace of Cups. And in the Book of Thoth, Crowley says, this card represents the element of water in its most secret and original form. It is the feminine complement of the Ace of Wands. I meant to say wands there. It is most feminine complement of the Ace of Wands and is derived from the yoni and the moon, exactly as that is from the lingam and the sun. The third in the hierarchy, he means Binah here, right? The third Sephiroth. The third in the hierarchy. This accordingly represents the essential form of the Holy Grail. Upon the dark sea of Binah, the Great Mother, are two lotuses, two in one, which fill the cup with the life fluid, symbolically represented either as water, as blood, or as wine, according to the selected purpose of the symbolism. So again, there's an interesting sense of the element of water and the cup being somehow the most mysterious of the elements. That's something I've seen a lot, and even in my own experience, I think that having gone through initiations and done magical work, I think that my conception of the element of water and of the cup has transformed and deepened more than any other. Yeah, just an interesting thing I've noticed. So it's interesting here too that you know, the element of water here in the cup can be represented as water, as blood, or as wine, but the thing itself is somehow, you know, it's the life fluid and can be represented by either any of those specific things, but it itself is somehow beyond like a specific fluid. Which links back to some of the stuff we were talking about right at the beginning with Thales and the Egyptian traditions of water, which is interesting. And you know, jumping back for a second to this diagram, you know, you can see how mother and father as wand and cup, you know, there's a very obvious like procreative symbolism there, as, you know, the wand as the male organ and the cup, you know, as the female organ, and then their union, the wand, you know, being like inserted into the cup is what produces the son and the daughter and the other two weapons. So we have that procreative symbolism again. All right, now we have the sword. The Ace of Swords is the primordial energy of air, the essence of the vow of tetragrammaton, the integration of the ruach. Air is the result of the conjunction of fire and water. Thus it lacks the purity of its superiors in the male hierarchy, fire, soul, and the phallus. It lacks the concentrated will of fire to unite with water. It has no corresponding passion for its twin element, earth. And again, we can get this idea about the volatile elements are the ones that Crowley are talking about as having a passion for uniting with their opposite. There is indeed a noble passivity in its nature. And again, that's that fixed quality that we're talking about. Evidently, it has no self-generated impulse, but set in motion by its father and mother, its power is manifestly terrific. It visibly attacks its objective, as they, being of a subtler and more tenuous character, can never do. One other thing that I think is important to notice about the symbolism of the sword and the dagger, especially the banishing dagger, is that the sword is something that divides things, right? So that we have the sense of analysis, of something being reduced to its component parts by being split up by the sword. And that's one way of thinking why we use swords and daggers for some of the purposes that we do, is because they divide things and reduce them to their component parts. All right, and then fourthly, we have the disc. Now the disc in this image is really just that central circle. It's being depicted as having like the six wings here. The disc itself is really just in the middle there. All right, so the Ace of Discs pictures the entry of that type of energy, which is called Earth. The discs are not to be considered at, oop, I kind of messed up my transcription here. I was doing this really quickly this morning. The discs are not to be considered as coins. The disc is a whirling emblem, naturally so, since it is now known that every star, every true planet is a whirling sphere. The atom, again, is no more the hard, intractable, dead particle of Dalton, but a system of whirling forces comparable to the solar hierarchy itself. So this passage in this section of the Book of Thoth on the disc is fairly long. It's like about 4 pages long. There's a lot of really dense material there. There's no way I can summarize it all here, but I really encourage you to take a look at that passage or look at it again if you haven't in a while. There's a lot going on there that I think is very, very profound. For the moment, I just want to point out that this is following along that same lines that we were talking about earlier about not seeing Earth as like a dead or inert thing, but as something alive and active. And it clearly realized this image of the disc as something whirling, something spinning, not as purely like passive and dead. And even comparing, the structure of the atom to like the structure of the solar system, and talking about those as related to the disc, I think is really profound and worthy of meditation. All right, and then, that's supposed to say the lamp at the top, not the disc. Yeah, sorry, this is like the last piece of this class that I put together. Sorry about that. So pretend that says the lamp at the top. All right, so this is an excerpt from book 4. So Crowley says about the lamp. This lamp is the light of the pure soul. It hath no need of fuel. It is the burning bush inconsumable that Moses saw, the image of the Most High. This lamp hangeth above the altar. It hath no support from below. Its light illumines the whole temple, yet upon it are cast no shadows, no reflections. It cannot be touched. It cannot be extinguished. In no way can it change, for it is utterly apart from all these things which have complexity, which have dimension, which change and may be changed. When the eyes of the Magist are fixed upon this lamp, naught else exists. The instruments lie idle on the altar. The light alone burns eternally. The divine will that was the wand is no more, for the path has become one with the goal. The divine understanding that was the cup is no more, for the subject and object of intelligence are one. The divine reason that was the sword is no more, for the complex has been resolved into the simple. And the divine substance that was the pentacle is no more, for the many has become the one. Eternal, unconfined, unextended, without cause and without effect, the holy lamp mysteriously burns, without quantity or quality. Unconditioned and sempiternal is this light. So I think that needs no comment, so we'll just move on. All right, last couple of things in our few minutes here. I just want to talk about some of the elemental spirits and some of the other entities that we can attribute to the 4 elements. So as I said, there's going to be an upcoming class series in January about planetary magic and zodiacal magic. So we'll talk a lot more about the zodiac signs and their relationship to the elements then. But just for the moment, I wanted to note that now in the 12 zodiac signs, 3 signs are attributed to each one of the elements, and those are the cardinal signs, which represent the beginning and inception of things, the fixed or cherubic signs, which is the most stable and sort of pure form of those things, and then the mutable signs, which are those elements or those things transforming and changing or ending or completing or kind of being understood. So the 4 cherubic signs attributed to each one of the 4 elements, in a way, most purely represent the elements in the zodiac. And so these are for fire, the cherubic sign of fire is Leo, the domicile of the sun. The cherubic sign of water is Scorpio, the night house of Mars. The cherubic sign of air is Aquarius, which is the day house of Saturn. And this is using traditional correspondences, which is important for planetary magic, because the modern correspondences don't really work anymore. Don't work when you're doing planetary and zodiacal magic. and then the cherubic sign of Earth, which is Taurus, the night house of Venus. And so some of you, I talked about this in more detail in that longer series that I did on the powers of the Sphinx. So there's been different animals, different cherubs associated with each one of the signs and the elements over time. And this is partially based on the zodiac and partially based on some other considerations as well. And we can talk about that in more detail in the upcoming class series. But the kind of default or standard one, this is the version that we teach, although we do recognize that there are variations for different purposes. The basic ones that you should know is that the cherub of fire is the lion, right? And Leo is literally lion. Now, the cherub of water, for our purposes, is most especially the serpent, which is one of the possible cherubs of Scorpio. You'll see the scorpion and the eagle as well, sometimes used for Scorpio. But the serpent is the best default one for our tradition. Now, for Aquarius, or for air, the cherub is the eagle. You'll also see this given as the man. In some sources, that derives from like the vision of Ezekiel and some other things. But for our purposes, the eagle is the best cherub for air. And then the bull is really the only cherub that's ever given for earth. I don't think I've ever seen a variation on that one. And so we can think about these four animals, the lion, the serpent, the eagle, and the bull, the four cherubim, as something like the heads of the elemental forces, and as like the rulers over the elemental spirits. So we'll spend a few minutes talking about the elemental spirits. Now, the idea of elemental spirits, goes way back into the Greek and earlier traditions, and I'm sure almost every culture on Earth has developed spirits of different elements. Spirits of water, spirits of different parts of the earth, spirits of the air, spirits of fire. But the idea of a specific set of like four elemental beings corresponding to the four elements, at least in our tradition, comes from Paracelsus, who's one of the really central and most important alchemists of the Renaissance tradition. And so Paracelsus wrote a short treatise. It's only about 25 or 30 pages on the book of the nymphs, sylphs, pygmies, and salamanders, and diverse or other spirits. So we use slightly different names than the one that Paracelsus used. So the spirits of fire are known as the salamanders. The spirits of water are called the undines, or Paracelsus calls them the nymphs. The spirit of air are called the sylphs. And then the spirits of earth are called the gnomes, and Paracelsus calls them the pygmies. So he's developing these ideas. He's basing these on Greek mythology, but he's kind of standardizing them into this like specific set of four beings. Though when I read this treatise recently, I was quite surprised at what Paracelsus says about them. So I'll read a couple quotes here, and then I'll make a few more comments. So Paracelsus says, "Know, therefore, that the purpose of this book is to describe the four kinds of spirit men, namely the water people, the mountain people, the fire people, and the wind people. For they are in everything like men, but without soul." And he's using men to mean, all of humanity. They're both male and female. He's just using that older sense of men as, generic human. For they are in everything like men, but without soul, and better than men, for they are like spirits which nobody can lift. They are witty, rich, clever, poor, dumb, like we who are from Adam, meaning humans, the Christian, worldview, the descendants of Adam. Their abode is of four kinds, namely according to the four elements: one in the water, one in the air, one in the earth, one in the fire. So yeah, Paracelsus says that they really are basically just like us in most ways. They do the same things that we do. They have the same types of lives that we do. They just have a different relationship to the elements. So he talks about how we can pass freely through the air, but not through earth. We can't pass through material objects, but we can pass through we can pass through air. But the elements, we're burned by fire, and we need water to live. And so the different elemental spirits have differing relationships to the elements. So the gnomes, or what he calls the pygmies, they move freely through the air, but can't move through the water. So they're essentially they're like persons, they're like people, but but just having these different elemental abodes. So that evolves as this tradition goes on, and it's hard to know exactly how literally to take a lot of the things that Paracelsus says in that document, but it's interesting. But it is the start of this idea of the 4 elemental spirits. Interesting little bit of historical trivia. In that book, he talks about the idea that the elemental spirits don't have souls, and this is coming from a Christian point of view, where humans are specially designated as having souls. But he talks about this idea that the elemental spirits, by marriage with humans, like literally by marrying humans, can gain souls. Now, we don't follow this tradition at all. This is just what Paracelsus says. But Hans Christian Andersen was familiar with Paracelsus's idea and took the idea of a water spirit who marries a human in order to gain a soul, and that's the story of the Little Mermaid. And so that in the original version of the Little Mermaid, the book Undine, that's the original version of the story, is that she marries a human in order to gain a soul. And then of course Disney, altered that later. But there's a direct line from Paracelsus to that Disney movie, which is a fun little bit of trivia. Okay, so in just our last few minutes here, I just wanted to read so Eliphas Levy, much later, picks up this same tradition of the 4 elemental spirits, though I think he has a more complex and interesting idea of what the spirits are. And he writes these 4 prayers, not prayers to the elemental spirits, but the prayers of the elemental spirits. So in each one, it's like the elemental spirits are praying to the Most High, or praying to the deity, to the divinity. Levy is still sort of a Christian. I mean, he's a weird sort of Christian, but he is basically a Christian. So there's some Christian language and symbolism in them. But I think one way that we can think about it in a less Christian sense is each of the elemental spirits in their prayer are directing their aspiration and their intention towards the Most High and towards the divine. So I'm going to read the 4 prayers of the elemental spirits, and if you'd like, you could use this as an opportunity to kind of meditate on it. I'm not going to show any particular images connected with this, so if you wanted to close your eyes and bring up maybe some of those associations and experiences of the elements that we from the very beginning of this workshop, or just let images and associations and things like that arise in your mind as I read them. Or you can just listen, whatever you'd like to do here. But these prayers are really nice ways of, or things that can be incorporated into ritual work and can be meditated on. And again, the idea is that in each of the prayers, we're sort of joining with or identifying with each one of those elementals, the kingdoms of spirits, and directing our aspiration towards spirit, towards the one that is beyond the multiplicity of the elements. So let's see, and those are found in Levy's book. It's Dogma and Ritual of High Magic, which is also sometimes called in English Transcendental Magic. And so you can look there. There's a few different translations that have been done because Levy, of course, wrote in French. So I'll give you McGregor Mather's translations here. All right, so we'll start with earth and move from earth to air, to water, to fire. All right, so the prayer of the gnomes. So again, if you want to take a moment and center yourself and use this as a meditative opportunity, you can do that. So we'll start with earth. So if you want to call up images and associations and feelings associated with earth. All right, and this is the prayer of the gnomes. O invisible King, who, taking the earth for foundation, didst hollow its depths to fill them with thy almighty power. Thou whose name shaketh the arches of the world, thou who causest the 7 metals to flow in the veins of the rocks, King of the 7 lights, rewarder of the subterranean workers, lead us into the desirable air and into the realm of splendor. We watch and we labor unceasingly. We seek and we hope. By the 12 stones of the holy city, by the buried talismans, by the axis of lodestone which passes through the center of the earth. O Lord, O Lord, O Lord, Have pity upon those who suffer. Expand our hearts, unbind and upraise our minds, enlarge our natures. O stability and motion, O darkness veiled in brilliance, O day clothed in night, O Master who never dost withhold the wages of thy workmen, O silver whiteness, O golden splendor, O crown of living and harmonious diamond, thou who wearest the heavens on thy finger like a ring of sapphire, thou who hidest beneath the earth in the kingdom of gems, the marvelous seed of the stars, live, reign, and be thou the eternal dispenser of the treasures whereof thou hast made us the guardians. All right, so just bring to a close any of your meditations on earth, and then you can make the transition to the element of air. And this is the prayer of the sylphs. Spirit of light, spirit of wisdom, whose breath giveth forth and withdraweth the form of all living things, thou before whom the life of beings is but a shadow which changeth, and a vapor which passeth, thou who mountest upon the clouds, and who walketh upon the wings of the wind, thou who breathest forth thy breath, and endless space is peopled, thou who drawest in thy breath, and all that cometh from thee returneth unto thee. Ceaseless movement and eternal stability, be thou eternally blessed. We praise thee and we bless thee in the changing empire of the created light, of shades, of reflections, and of images, and we aspire without cessation unto thy immutable and imperishable brilliance. Let the ray of thine intelligence and the warmth of thy love penetrate even unto us. Then that which is volatile shall be fixed. The shadow shall be a body. The spirit of air shall be a soul. The dream shall be a thought. And no longer shall we be swept along by the tempest, but we shall hold the bridles of the winged steeds of dawn. And we shall direct the course of the evening breeze to fly before thee. O Spirit of spirits, O eternal soul of souls, O imperishable breath of life, O creative sigh, O mouth which breathest forth and withdraweth the life of all beings in the flux and reflux of thine eternal word, which is the divine ocean of movement and of truth. Amen. All right, you can bring your meditation on air to a close, and we will transition to water. All right, and this is the prayer of the undines, the water spirits. Terrible King of the sea, thou who holdest the keys of the cataracts of heaven, and who enclosest the subterranean waters in the cavernous hollows of earth, King of the deluge and of the rains of spring, thou who openest the sources of the rivers and of the fountains, thou who commandest moisture, which is as it were the blood of the earth, to become the sap of plants. We adore thee and we invoke thee. Speak thou unto us, thy mobile and changeful creatures, in the great tempests of the sea, and we shall tremble before thee. Speak to us also in the murmur of the limpid waters, and we shall desire thy love. O vastness wherein all the rivers of being seek to lose themselves, which renew themselves ever in thee. O thou ocean of infinite perfections, O height which reflectest thyself in the depth, O depth with which exalteth thyself into the height. Lead us into the true life through intelligence, through love. Lead us into immortality through sacrifice, so that we may be found worthy to offer one day unto thee the blood and the tears for the remission of sins. All right, and then you can bring your meditation on water to a close, and we'll move to our final prayer and our final meditation on fire. And this is the prayer of the salamanders. Immortal, eternal, ineffable, and uncreated Father of all, born upon the chariot of worlds, which ever roll in ceaseless motion, ruler over the ethereal vastness, where the throne of thy power is raised, from the summit of which thine eyes behold all, and thy pure and holy ears hear all. Help us, thy children, whom thou hast loved since the birth of the ages of time. Thy majesty golden, vast and eternal, shineth above the heaven of stars. Above them art thou exalted, O thou glittering fire. There thou illuminateth all things with thine insupportable glory, whence flow the ceaseless stream of splendor, which nourisheth thine infinite spirit. This infinite spirit nourisheth all, and maketh that inexhaustible treasure of generation which ever encompasseth thee, replete with the numberless forms wherewith thou hast filled it from the beginning. From this spirit arise those most holy kings who are around thy throne and who compose thy court. O universal Father, one and alone, Father alike of immortals and of mortals, thou hast especially created powers similar unto thy thought eternal and unto thy venerable essence. Thou hast established them above the angels who announce thy will to the world. Lastly, thou hast created us as a third order in our elemental empire. There our continual exercise is to praise and to adore thy desires. There we ceaselessly burn with eternal aspiration unto thee. O Father, O Mother of mothers, O archetype eternal of maternity and of love, O Son, the flower of all sons, form of all forms, soul, spirit, harmony, and numeral of all things. Amen. All right, so you can bring your meditation on fire to a close, and any final impressions or thoughts that came up during that practice. All right, and with our last just a couple minutes here, I just wanted to show you two final images from the Renaissance art tradition of again these sort of allegories of the four elements. So this is from a very large painting by artist Wolfert on the four elements here. This painting is these figures are almost life-sized here. Oh, let's see. I saw a comment. I missed a comment earlier. Let's see. Pagam says, "How does this relate to the idea of the concept of the four familiars?" I'm actually not familiar with the concept of the four familiars. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure what you're referring to there. Yeah, you can go ahead and clarify there. I'll just say a few things about this painting. Yeah, so we see on the left that's Vulcan, from Roman mythology, or Hephaestus from Greek mythology. There, you can see he's holding the hammer, because he's a smith working the forge, and he has a torch of fire. So he obviously represents the element of fire. Now, next to him, we have representing air. There, we can tell by there's the dead birds on the stick there, and then it's apparently a bird of paradise in his other hand that he's raising above his head. It's not exactly clear who this is, though it may be the god Apollo, but this is clearly representing the element of air. And then seated next to him, we see the god Neptune, representing the element of water, and pouring out his vase of water there. And then next to him, we see the goddess Ceres, and she's carrying the cornucopia, which is her usual emblem, the emblem of the fertility and bounty of the earth. And there's also a rabbit next to her, which is an emblem of fertility and the fertility of the earth. All right, and then just one more similar allegory of the elements. This is by Jan Bruegel the Younger and Franz Fraken the Younger. Franz Fraken did the individual figures, and then Jan Bruegel did the rest of the imagery there, which is the normal way in the like medieval and Renaissance guild systems, where the master would do the main figures, and then like the student or journeyman or whatever would do the rest of the image. Yeah, so again, similar kind of allegory of the 4 elements, though here they're being represented by 4 female figures. So let's see, on the right here, we see the goddess Ceres again, the goddess of the earth and the goddess of grain and the fertility of the earth. And again, she's holding that cornucopia that she's identified with. Then on the left, this is Amphitrite, who's the goddess of the oceans. She's the wife of Neptune in Greek mythology. And you can see that she's pouring out a vase of water, similar to what Neptune was doing. There's also fish falling out of her vase, which is interesting. And she's also carrying a seashell there, which is her usual, her emblem that identifies her as the goddess Amphitrite. Then at the top, we see the muse. This is the muse Urania. And we can recognize this as Urania because she's carrying, it might be a little hard to see with the image at this scale, but she's carrying an armillary sphere. And because Urania was the muse of astrologers and astronomers, she carries the armillary sphere as an emblem of that. And then in the center, we see the goddess Vesta, who's the goddess of the hearth, and she represents fire. And you can see she has like some kind of stone or fire there, representing the hearth. And you can also see that she, her hair looks like fire, and Urania is born on the winds, and so each one of them, just in their physical bearing and demeanor, also represents the elements. And then all around them, we see birds in the sky, we see fish, we see birds, land creatures, water creatures. Next to kind of to the right of Ceres, there we see farmers like tending the fields. So the whole image, and even the rabbit down in the lower right corner representing like the fertility of the earth. So the whole image is exactly what it's called, an allegory of the 4 elements. So yeah, I just thought this was a really nice painting and a really nice image of the elements. And just a couple of examples of the way that these were used in classical art and continue to be. I mean, there's plenty of 19th century like symbolist and romantic art that uses similar emblems of the elements. And in the 20th century, that continues, especially like in surrealism and in a lot of poetry and things like that. You can still see a lot of these emblems of the different elements in art and literature. Okay, let's see. Halcom says, Crowley states that the magician is allotted 4 familiars. Undine reminds me of that sort of elemental familiar, and Iocratic seems to have a similar relation to what seems to be her HGA. Yeah, I can't think of the reference that you're talking about there. If you remember where that's from, let me know. Because I really don't remember Crowley saying that. So yeah, let me know if you think of it. And that's, I don't know a ton about Iocratic, but what I do know about her, I think you're right. I think that connection makes a lot of sense. All right, so that brings us to our conclusion, and we're just barely over 2 hours here. So there we go. Yeah, maybe it was Disney. So yeah, if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to hang out for a few more minutes, but you've probably had enough of listening to me for one day. So for more information about our work, you can check out TOS.org/FAQ, and then you can learn about both our academic as well as our initiatory track. There's also forms for applications if you are so moved to apply for membership. There's also contact information there as well if you have any questions, you want to get in touch with us. There's my email address there in the middle. I'm happy to send people copies of the slides. Although for anyone who's a member of TOTS, I'll put links to the slides up on the forum in the next couple of days, so you can just download them off the forum. But for anyone who's not a member, please feel free to email me and I can email them to you or provide you with the links. I forget how big the files are, but I'll get them to you one way or another. Happy to answer any other questions about the material here. I'm also happy to answer sort of general questions about Temple of the Silver Star and our programs and training or anything like that. So please feel free to get in touch with me. Normally we have normally we have a $5 suggested donation for our classes. Since this was a double length class, I'll suggest a $10 donation here. That is just a suggested donation, and that's only for people who are non-members. If you're an initiate or a member of our academic track, you already support our work. So yeah. For anyone on YouTube, thanks for watching. Yeah, stay tuned for announcements about upcoming classes. As of right now, there's also another class series being run by two of our other academic instructors that's meeting on Wednesday nights. And they are reading through Magick Without Tears, doing a few chapters in each session. You'd be welcome to drop in on that. You can check out our Facebook page, or if you send me an email, I can send you a link to the info too. So you'd be welcome to attend those classes as well. And like I said, starting up at some point in January, probably like in the second weekend in January, I'll be starting an ongoing class series on planetary magic, hexagram rituals, and zodiacal magic, and some other topics related to the planets and Kabbalah and the Thelema. So yeah, thanks for watching. If you're on YouTube, you can subscribe, to stay to get updates on any future upcoming videos. So yeah, thanks for watching. 93s.